Brookings Institute scholar that's caused that to happen. No, I mean, you know, the criminal justice system involves very many people, prosecutors, judges, juries, a wide array of the public. So for the prison population to go down nationally, that reflects some very widespread view of the public. Now, I think the public changed its views in fairly short order. Many, though not all, liberal elites did not for many, many years, really, until you get to the 1990s. But I think Ben recognized it right away, and that's one of the things that the real majority recognizes, that although the country may have gone off the track on the crime issue, that basically common sense was restored. Most people understand that crime is a real bad thing, and that you should, you know, prosecute perpetrators of crime, and you should have policing standards which are effective and which prevent crimes from occurring. You know, I was one of those liberals at that time that that said law and order is a cry of racism. You're just trying to lock up black people. And we had the same comment as late as the 1988 presidential campaign, when you had Michael Dukakis was attacked for the furlough program, which he had supported over 11 years of controversy, which said that people sentenced to life without parole should be allowed to leave prison on the weekends. It was said that Dukakis didn't counter this argument with his own arguments. There is no good argument for letting out people convicted of life without parole over the weekend. It can only be explained as a sort of reflexive twitch that says somehow it's unjust that people are in prison, so we should let them out anytime, any way we can conceivably do so. And yet it was widely asserted then, and 20 years later it is still widely asserted, that to criticize Michael Dukakis on that was to appeal to racism, as if voters in America were only interested in keeping black people in jail rather than being interested in keeping murderers sentenced to life without parole in jail. You don't have to be a racist to think that a murderer sentenced to that sentence should be kept in jail. You just have to have some common sense. But that's a battle we're going to have to continue to fight in political commentary this year, because we're hearing once again about the, quote, Willie Horton ad. I think I think I'll conclude by just saying that there are a couple of anecdotes to illustrate the sort of craziness of the time and the level head that Ben took. One on McGovern delegates. I remember being at the 72 Democratic National Convention in Miami. I was a McGovern supporter. And I saw these people, sort of hippie-looking kids they were the delegates from the 3rd Congressional District of Louisiana. That's the Cajun country. And I said to them, how did you get elected delegates? You know, I mean, we know something about Louisiana politicians, right? Well, the insider politicians in Louisiana had said, we're going to have one caucus in each congressional district, and it's going to be at Saturday at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And they all figured that they and their buddies would go there and dominate it. And these kids went to a campus, I don't know whether it's Southwest Louisiana in Lafayette or something, and they said, free dope if you show up to the convention site in Louisiana. And by God, they had the numbers there. They didn't tell me, and I didn't ask whether they delivered on an admittedly illegal promise, and we didn't get any farther on that. So it was a wild and crazy time. But the last point I make is that, yes, indeed, this is beach reading. I gather, in a sense, this is your autobiography, Ben, or this is what you want to do in the way of an autobiography.
It's a political autobiography.
A political.
It stays away from most personal things.
Stays away. Okay, but it's a political biography. But you know, the resemblance to Philip Roth, who of course grew up in a neighborhood similar to Ben's in Newark, New Jersey, is not totally absent. I would just point you, without making further specifications, to the scene where Ben first meets his new employer, President Johnson, because Lyndon Johnson, at the beginning of the scene, is in his pajamas. I'll say no more. Buy the book.
Thank you very much, Ben, EJ, and Michael. I think you can tell that we are all fans of Ben Wattenberg. So now I'm going to turn the floor over to all of you for your questions about this presidential race, about the book. Yes. And if you could please identify yourself.
Thanks. Gary Mitchell from the Mitchell Report. And I can't help but, two things. One, I can't help but say that since a couple of people have mentioned it, I think I am the owner of the most underlined, annotated version of E.J. Dionne's Why Americans Hate Politics, which I know he couldn't have written if he hadn't been a Wattenberger. I would love to come back to the moment when Bill Moyers went left and you went right. And
I didn't go right. I stayed right.
I wonder if you... My simple question is what doesn't Bill Moyers understand?
Look, it's a big country with a lot of views. What he understands is what he understands. I mean, I think he's an honorable guy. We've remained friends. Occasionally I hear that he has complained to people that, you know, God, I'm the guy who brought Wattenberg to Washington. That's not quite true. I had written the book, but he was very cordial to me. He's got his own agenda. He's got his own views. There's a very interesting interplay in the book, and I sort of use it as a running theme about this embodies in two people this chasm, this split that developed. And I saw him recently for the LBJ Centennial. He, as I say, he always treated me very graciously. He's still a friend, but people have different views. Now, just a couple of other things. If you could remember up at C-SPAN, tell Brian Lamb that you could use this as a eulogy. That would be great. And let me say one other thing. The real majority, you know, until the real majority came out, it was said that the economic issue is the #1 issue. That goes back to the Great Depression. If you could capture the economy, you capture the election. Now, Scammon and I wrote that the social issue had become co-equal with the economic issue. And then in 1996, I wrote a book called Values Matter Most, this one on my own. And I maintained then, and I would maintain now, that that social issue is not co-equal, but #1. If you cannot convince the electorate that you will run a stable, law-abiding community, you are going to finish as a loser. It's just that simple, and it makes, again, it's common sense. I mean, if people can't live in cities, and, you know, Truman Capote wrote that great book, In Cold Blood, in rural areas, and that deliverance, if criminality holds sway, you cannot have a society. I mean, that is the oldest axiom in the book, in history. It's just, and then one other acknowledgement. My colleague Michael Novak is here, and he has really written a book, The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism, which shaped the world in America, but around the world when people were fighting for liberty. That's the book they turned to. It's a monumental achievement. Michael's only written about 40 books, but that's the one that I remember, and I'm a little jealous because I only wrote 13. But
other questions?
Could I, by the way, say something just on the history of the real majority that's interesting? Some of you probably know this, that in his, you know, that book was written primarily to influence Democrats and to try to give them a strategy for winning elections. But in a quirk of history, there was a young man who worked for Richard Nixon called Pat Buchanan. And Pat Buchanan got his hands on the book, and Richard Nixon talks about this in his memoir. And he brought the real majority thesis to Richard Nixon and said, you know, this is the way to go. And Nixon writes that, you know, that, I realized that Wattenberg was right, and that the shape of the 72 campaign, dismayingly to some of us, the whole kind of acid amnesty and abortion campaign that Nixon ran against George McGovern, very much came from, it was like a double play of Wattenberg to Buchanan to Nixon. And it's just one of the...
Bob Novak's phrase, but I mean, it's fair.
Oh, is that...
Well, it's actually not Bob Novak's phrase. Novak revealed in his memoir that Senator Tom Eagleton, briefly the Democratic nominee for vice president,
it was originally
used the phrase.
Said that Hugh Scott did it, the majority leader or the minority leader, but Novak said that he got it from him. But anyway,
he got it from Eagleton. But we're talking about acid amnesty and abortion, not Wattenberg to Buchanan to Nixon. Right.
But I think it's fair to say in the 70 and 72 cycle, some Democratic candidates for senator, you talk about Hubert Humphrey's 1970 campaign, did profit from your advice, I think. You did act on your advice and profit from it. And it's one reason that the 70 cycle had the most seriously contested Senate races of any cycle in history. About 25 of the 34 or so races up that year were seriously contested. It was a huge battle with the Democratic Party trying to hold the Senate, Republicans under Nixon trying to...
I worked for Hubert when he regained his Senate seat in 1970.
Yeah.
I worked for Humphrey when he regained his Minnesota Senate seat in 1970, and I kept putting the word tough in the speech. We have to be tough on this and tough on that, and he kept crossing it out, crossing it out, crossing it out. And then he gave a big speech to the American Bar Association in St. Louis, and I wrote a pretty tough speech. He kept crossing it out and crossing it out, and he called in somebody else to make it gentler. And then he in fact, I cite it in the book at some length, and then he gave a speech that even I wouldn't write. It was so tough, so hard, about the Georgetown limousine liberals and just sipping their martinis. I mean, it was unbelievable. And he was attacked by both the left and the right for selling out the Law and Order. But Norman Sherman, who was one of my dear friends, a lot of you know him, one of the funniest men in American politics, it got huge coverage. And it said, you cut off, Clark McGregor was his opponent, you cut off the one argument that McGregor had, which that he was soft. And Hubert was a very tough, he was mayor of Minneapolis when the communists tried to take over the city. So he was a very, very tough anti-communist. And it's very interesting on the history of the Cold War. I mean, there's all this talk about Vietnam, what a tragedy it was, and it certainly was. There's a big difference between Vietnam and Iraq. In my judgment, everybody in Iraq is a volunteer. That was not true in Vietnam. Was it a mistake? You can argue it forever. But by definition, a war is a series of battles, and the person who wins the last one wins the war. And we won the last battle in the Cold War. The Union disappeared, literally disappeared. The nations of Eastern Europe became free. The independent republics became free or semi-free. And the victory in the Cold War in the late 1980s, early 1990s, I think will go down in history as one of the great human achievements. And I was the vice chairman of the board of Radio Free Liberty, and I had started this coalition for a Democratic majority, which was a very hawkish sort of group. And look, I didn't play the kind of role that the Pope played or Scoop Jackson played, but I did do a little bit, and that's about as, on the political side, that's about as proud as you can get. I mean, that changed the world, and it was not Ronald Reagan, it was not Harry Truman, it was the voters of the free countries of the world, year after year after year, voting to spend huge amounts of money to stop the Soviet military machine and give a chance for the war of ideas to grab hold. And so the military stopped the military threat. The war, the Cold War, by my lights, was won by ideas. And we had a big when we first came, there was a book, some books you don't even have to read more than the title. There was a book a very dense book by a guy named Richard Weaver, and that was the buzzword around there. And the book was called Ideas Have Consequences.